assistant is staring at a computer screen, and she cannot make sense of what it is telling her. For 7 years, a small team of scientists has been chasing a single fragile idea: that the skin of a 2,000-year-old animal might still be hiding a secret that no historian, no linguist, and no archaeologist had ever thought to look for. The sequencing results are finally back, and something is wrong. Or rather, something is impossibly right. 2 fragments, both supposedly written by the same devout desert community, both believed for 70 years to belong to the same tightly knit religious sect, do not match. Their DNA says they came from 2 completely different animals, raised in 2 completely different environments. One of those animals could never have survived in the desert where these scrolls were supposedly written. If that is true, then an entire chapter of religious history, taught in universities, printed in textbooks, and displayed in the world's most respected museums, is about to be rewritten. This is the story of how a shepherd's lost goat in 1947 led, 73 years later, to a DNA test that shook one of the most sacred archives on Earth. To understand why this discovery mattered so much, you have to go back to where it all began. In 1947, in the hills near the Dead Sea, not far from the border with Jordan, a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad ed-Dib was searching for a goat that had wandered off from his flock. Climbing among the limestone cliffs, he came across a narrow opening in the rock. Thinking his goat might have crawled inside, he tossed a stone into the darkness. Instead of a bleat, he heard something shatter. Curiosity pulled him inside, and there, sitting in the dust of that cave, were tall clay jars that looked as if no one had touched them in centuries. Inside those jars were rolled leather scrolls, wrapped carefully in strips of linen. Neither the shepherd nor anyone else at that moment understood that this accident was about to become one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Word of the find spread, and over the following decade, archaeologists and Bedouin treasure hunters combed the surrounding cliffs. Between 1947 and 1956, explorers uncovered material in 11 separate caves scattered around the ancient site of Qumran. By the time the digging slowed down, roughly 25,000 fragments had been pulled from the rock, representing pieces of nearly 900 to 1,000 separate manuscripts. Among them were the oldest surviving copies of biblical books like Genesis, Isaiah, and Psalms, centuries older than any biblical text previously known. There were also hymns, community rules, calendars, and prophetic writings never seen before. Using paleography and later radiocarbon dating, scholars placed the scrolls somewhere between the 3rd century before the Common Era and the 1st century after it, a window that captured one of the most turbulent and formative periods in Jewish history, the final years of the Second Temple. The scrolls almost didn't survive to become famous at all inside a sealed, clean room in Uppsala, Sweden in the early months of 2020, a Research L. Many of the earliest fragments passed through the hands of a Bethlehem antiquities dealer and cobbler known as Kando, who bought them from the Bedouin for a fraction of their worth and quietly resold them onward. Some of the most important scrolls, including the now legendary Great Isaiah Scroll, were first examined not by a famous archaeologist, but by a young American scholar named John Trevor, who photographed them in 1948 and was startled to realize their script looked centuries older than anything previously known from that period. A handful of scroll, how less were even nearly lost to history in a stranger way still. In 1954, a small classified advertisement ran quietly in the Wall Street Journal, offering 4 ancient biblical manuscripts for private sale. Almost no one who saw that ad had any idea it was advertising some of the most significant religious documents ever unearthed. They were eventually purchased and brought to Israel by the archaeologist Yigael Yadin, arranged through an intermediary so the seller would not realize who was really buying them. Almost immediately, one question dominated every conversation about the scrolls: who wrote them? For decades, one answer rose above all the others and hardened into something close to unquestioned fact. The scrolls, the theory said, were the library of the Essenes, a strict Jewish sect mentioned by the ancient writers Josephus and Pliny the Elder as a group that withdrew from mainstream society to live a disciplined, almost monastic existence centered on ritual purity and the copying of sacred texts. The ruins at Qumran, sitting just above the caves, were identified as the Essenes settlement. Evidence seemed to line up neatly. Some scrolls described strict rules for communal living. Others referenced a 364-day solar calendar, sharply different from the lunar calendar used at the temple in Jerusalem, suggesting a group that had deliberately broken away from the religious mainstream. Then there was the War Scroll, a dramatic text describing an apocalyptic battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, the kind of worldview scholars believed only an isolated, embattled sect would produce. The physical ruins at Qumran itself seemed to back the story up. Archaeologists excavating the site found a large communal dining hall, multiple ritual bathing pools cut into the rock, and inkwells that some scholars identified as belonging to a scriptorium, a dedicated writing room. Nearby, a cemetery containing more than 1,000 burials was found to be overwhelmingly male, which fit neatly with ancient descriptions of the Essenes as a celibate order. Pliny the Elder had even written that a solitary Essene community lived along the western shore of the Dead Sea, keeping company with nothing but palm trees, deliberately isolated from ordinary society. To many scholars, it looked like the ruins, the texts, and the ancient historians all lined up perfectly, and the case felt closed. Museums built entire exhibits around this narrative. Documentaries repeated it as settled history. Students for 2 generations were taught the same story. A small band of ascetic monks in the desert hiding their treasured library in caves to protect it from the advancing Roman army during the Jewish revolt. But cracks in that tidy story had been showing for years, before anyone thought to bring in a DNA lab. Scholars comparing handwriting across the fragments noticed the scripts varied wildly, from careful professional calligraphy to rough, almost amateur lettering. If a single tight-knit community had produced all of this material, why did it look like the work of so many different hands, trained in so many different traditions? Then there was the parchment itself. Some pieces were prepared with obvious skill and expensive materials. Others were coarse and uneven, the kind of quality control you would not expect from one disciplined scriptorium. Radiocarbon dating added another layer of confusion. Some scrolls tested older than the Qumran settlement itself was believed to be, raising an uncomfortable question. If the community hadn't even built its home yet, how were its members supposedly writing scrolls that predated it? And then there was Jeremiah. Among the fragments, researchers found 2 distinctly different versions of the Book of Jeremiah, one considerably longer than the other, with entire sections, rearranged. If this was the output of one devoted community following one unbroken scribal tradition, why would it preserve 2 competing versions of the same sacred book? In response, a handful of alternative theories emerged. Maybe Qumran wasn't a religious retreat at all, but a pottery workshop, or a fortified military outpost with no connection to any particular sect. Maybe the caves functioned as a kind of communal safe, deposit box, a place where sacred writings from many different communities were stored for safekeeping rather than produced. One of the most serious challenges came from University of Chicago historian Norman Golb, who argued for years, long before anyone thought to test DNA, that the scrolls were never a single-sex private library at all. Golb proposed that they were instead the scattered remains of several library collections evacuated from Jerusalem and hidden in the desert as the Roman legions closed in. At the time, most of his colleagues dismissed the idea as too speculative to overturn decades of accepted teaching. Each rival idea had a certain logic, but none of them had anything close to solid proof. Faced with speculation on one side and a 70-year-old consensus on the other, most scholars simply kept teaching the Essene theory because it was the version everyone already knew. Then, in 2012, on a bus during an orientation session from Renan, faculty at Tel Aviv University, 2 strangers ended up sitting next to each other. One was Oded Rachavi, a molecular biologist who spent his career studying inheritance and genetics and microscopic worms. The other was Noam Mizrahi, a scholar of ancient Hebrew literature who had spent years working directly with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Making conversation, Mizrahi mentioned the same old puzzle that had frustrated his field for decades, the maddening task of figuring out which of the 25,000 tiny fragments belonged together when all anyone had to go on was handwriting, ink color, and educated guesswork. Rachavi asked what the scrolls were actually written on. Animal skin, Mizrahi told him. Parchment. Rachavi paused. Parchment, he said, contains DNA. That single realization, an idea so obvious in hindsight that it is almost strange. Nobody had pursued it seriously before, would eventually take 7 years, a Swedish genetics lab, an Israeli antiquities authority, and a New York City medical school to turn into hard science. The obstacle in front of them was enormous. These were not ordinary artifacts you could snip a corner off of for testing. The Dead Sea Scrolls are among the most closely guarded historical objects on the planet, and the Israel Antiquities Authority was never going to authorize cutting into a 2,000-year-old biblical manuscript just to satisfy scientific curiosity. So the team, working with the IAEA's own conservators, developed an extremely careful sampling protocol. Wherever a fragment could tolerate it, conservators used a fine scalpel to remove an almost invisible sliver, less than half a square centimeter, from a blank, uninscribed edge, never touching a single letter of text. Where a fragment was too fragile even for that, they instead collected the loose crumbs of parchment dust that had already flaked off the uninscribed back over decades of storage. Either way, the writing itself was never disturbed. In total, conservators sampled around 39 specimens from roughly 24 scrolls, along with additional leather items from the surrounding region, including sandals and water skins, to serve as comparison material. Extracting usable DNA from something 2,000 years old, contaminated by centuries of handling, heat, and decay, is brutally difficult. So the samples were flown to Sweden, to a specialized ancient DNA laboratory at Uppsala University, run by geneticist Matthias Jakobsen, one of the few facilities in the world equipped to handle material this degraded and this precious. Researchers worked in sealed, clean rooms, wearing full protective suits, under strict protocols designed to keep modern human DNA, the DNA of everyone who had ever handled the scrolls over the last 2 millennia, from contaminating the ancient signal they were hunting for. In parallel, a team led by geneticist Christopher Mason at Weill Cornell Medicine in New York analyzed the microbial residue clinging to the parchment, adding yet another layer of forensic detail. Contamination turned out to be the team's biggest enemy. Every scroll had passed through the hands of shepherds, dealers, curators, and researchers for decades, and every single one of those people had left behind traces of their own modern DNA. Retested over and over, it took years of failed attempts before the team had confidence in their results. When the data finally came together, the first finding was almost anticlimactic. Nearly every single scroll sampled had been written on sheepskin, not goatskin as many had long assumed. Sheep, like goats, could be raised on minimal water and sparse desert vegetation, so this fit comfortably with a Judean desert origin and barely raised an eyebrow. But then came the finding nobody expected. 2 of the sampled fragments were made not from sheep, but from cattle. And cattle change everything. Raising cows requires large volumes of water every single day, and open, grassy pasture, resources that simply do not exist in the arid stretch of desert surrounding Qumran. There was no realistic way to farm cattle in that landscape, which meant there was no realistic way those 2 fragments had been produced there. They had to have come from somewhere else entirely, somewhere with rivers, grassland, and a settled agricultural economy, and been carried to the caves only afterward. Here is where the discovery turned personal for the Essene theory in a way that raw geography alone couldn't. The 2 cowhide fragments were not random scraps. Both of them came from copies of the Book of Jeremiah, the same prophetic text scholars had already flagged as existing in 2 conflicting versions. Researchers had previously debated whether one of those cowhide Jeremiah fragments might actually belong to the very same scroll as a separate sheepskin fragment found nearby. The DNA settled that argument permanently. Different animal, different origin, different scroll. It was not a copying error or a scribal accident. It was physical. Proof that 2 distinct versions of Jeremiah had been produced in 2 entirely different places, almost certainly by 2 different communities, who each considered their version to be the authoritative one. Scholars had actually known about this textual split for well over a century from a completely different angle. The ancient Greek translation of Jeremiah used by early Christians is roughly 1/7 shorter than the traditional Hebrew version familiar today, and it arranges entire blocks of prophecy in a different order. For generations, this was treated as a translation quirk, a Greek editor, trimming and rearranging the Hebrew original. The Qumran fragments proved otherwise. Hebrew versions matching both the longer and the shorter arrangement turned up among the scrolls themselves, meaning the difference went back to the Hebrew source, came from parchment prepared at the same time, in the same place, possibly by the same workshop. Fragments from wildly different, unrelated animal populations pointed to entirely separate origins. For the first time, scholars had a forensic tool that did not depend on subjective judgments about handwriting style or ink shade. In some cases, the DNA confirmed groupings scholars had already guessed at from the handwriting alone. In other cases, it proved that fragments long assumed to belong together were, genetically, complete strangers to each other, forcing a quiet but significant rewrite of how several manuscripts had been classified for decades. The implications rippled outward from Jeremiah into other texts entirely. Take the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, a liturgical work describing angelic worship in a heavenly temple, found not only among the desert community. It had circulated widely enough to reach a Jewish fortress on a mountaintop far from Qumran, meaning its influence and the mystical religious ideas it contained extended much further across ancient Judea than anyone had assumed. Then there was Isaiah, arguably the most beloved and frequently copied biblical book found among the scrolls. DNA testing on one particular Isaiah fragment produced a result that still has no tidy explanation. Its genetic signature didn't match the animal populations associated with any of the known Qumran caves. Something about its origin pointed toward a location that has not yet been identified, raising the tantalizing and slightly unsettling possibility that there is still an undiscovered cache of scrolls out there somewhere, its location known only to the sheep, or cows, whose skin once carried it. Once the DNA results were laid side by side with everything scholars already knew, the old tidy story of a single ascetic sect quietly copying scripture in desert isolation could no longer hold together. A new explanation. gained ground instead, rooted in a much older Jewish tradition called a Genizah. Under Jewish law, any document that contained the name of God could never simply be thrown away or destroyed, no matter how worn out or damaged it became. Instead, such texts were retired to a sacred storage space, treated with the same respect in death, so to speak, as they had received in active use. Many scholars now believe the caves surrounding Qumran functioned as exactly this kind of storage on a massive scale. Jerusalem sat only around 20 kilometers away, a difficult but entirely manageable journey in antiquity. Between the years 68 and 70 of the Common Era, the Roman military crushed the Jewish revolt and destroyed Jerusalem, including the Second Temple. In the chaos of that catastrophe, communities across the region would have scrambled to protect their most sacred possessions, including personal family scrolls, synagogue collections, and temple documents, by hiding them wherever safety could be found. The caves near the Dead Sea, remote and difficult to reach, would have made an obvious refuge. Under this reading, the scrolls were never the private property of one isolated sect at all. They were a shared, accumulated inheritance, swept together from many different Jewish communities in the desperate final years before Jerusalem fell. The consequences of that shift go far, beyond archaeology. For generations, many people assumed that by the time of Jesus, the text of the Hebrew Bible existed in something close to its modern, standardized form. The Dead Sea Scrolls had already complicated that assumption before DNA ever entered the picture, since multiple divergent versions of books like Jeremiah, Genesis, and Psalms turned up among the fragments, some with entire passages missing, reordered, or added. What the genetic evidence did was remove any lingering excuse to treat those differences as scribal sloppiness or copying error. These were not mistakes. They were living, competing traditions, maintained deliberately by different communities who each believed their version was correct. The process later generations would call canonization, the slow process of settling on one official, authoritative version of each sacred book, had simply not finished yet. Judaism in this period was not one uniform religion practiced identically everywhere. It was a landscape of overlapping communities, each with its own customs, calendars, and even its own scripture. That was the exact religious world Jesus of Nazareth was born into and preached within, and it was the same fractured, plural environment out of which the early Christian movement would soon emerge. Understanding that diversity, rather than assuming a false uniformity, has become one of the most significant shifts in how historians now approach the origins of both rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity. As if the genetic revelations weren't dramatic enough on their own, the years surrounding this research were also marked by a scandal that exposed just how much money, faith, and fraud had become entangled with these ancient texts. Starting around 2002, a wave of previously unknown Dead Sea Scroll fragments began quietly appearing on the private antiquities market, offered to wealthy collectors and religious institutions eager to own a piece of biblical history. The Museum of the Bible in Washington, funded largely by the Hobby Lobby founder's family, acquired 16 such fragments and proudly displayed them as genuine artifacts from the same discovery that stunned the world in 1947. Scholars had voiced doubts for years, and in 2018, scientific testing confirmed that 5 of those 16 fragments were almost certainly forgeries. The museum kept investigating, and in March of 2020, just months before the cell DNA study made headlines, an independent forensic team delivered a devastating final verdict. All 16 fragments were fakes, deliberately manufactured in the 20th century using old, genuine leather, sometimes cut from ancient sandals or shoes, and inked to mimic authentic ancient script. Investigators found pooled ink sitting inside cracks that had formed in the leather long after it dried, a technical giveaway, impossible to fake convincingly. Experts now estimate as many as 70 forged fragments have circulated on the market since 2002. Meaning other private and institutional collections around the world may be sitting on fakes of their own, still unexamined. It is a striking reminder that even as cutting-edge genetics was proving which real scrolls came from where, old-fashioned deception was actively fooling some of the very institutions meant to safeguard this history. Since the DNA results were published as the cover story of the journal Cell in June of 2020, the entire field has shifted its center of gravity. Researchers are no longer content to ask only what a scroll says. They now want to know where its animal technology is resurrecting text that has been invisible to the naked eye for centuries. Letters and words swallowed by fading ink and darkened leather, now becoming legible again under specialized light. Combine that recovered text with genetic origin data, and researchers are, for the first time, mapping something that was never visible before, an entire invisible network of scribes. Communities and religious centers spread across ancient Judea, quietly exchanging and copying sacred texts long before anyone wrote the rules for what belonged in the Bible. Even the researchers involved are careful to say this is not a closed case. The DNA does not answer every question, and in some instances, like that lone unmatched Isaiah fragment, it has opened up mysteries nobody previously knew to ask about. But that, in a strange way, is the most honest conclusion this story could arrive at. For nearly 70 years, the world was so captivated by the words inside the Dead Sea Scrolls that almost nobody thought to interrogate the material those words were written on. It took a chance conversation on a university bus, a 7-year genetic marathon spanning Israel, Sweden, and the United States, and the reluctant cooperation of long-dead sheep and cattle to finally ask the right question, somewhere in the hills above the Discovery was written on, and in doing so would quietly dismantle one of the most widely believed stories in modern archaeology. The ink told scholars what these ancient communities believed. The skin, it turns out, has been telling us who they really were all along.